I'm very pleased that I'll be speaking about my book this evening, Punk Orientalism, The Art of Rebellion, which was published in 2022. And I'm just circulating a copy of the book. They'll be making the rounds, but I will kindly ask you if there's time to just do a short reading at the end from the book. So my research, as Branji kindly mentioned, is I'm very much interested in punk methodologies, which may have a lot to do with my British education. Although I'm looking at a part of the world that is sort of connected to the former Soviet Union, as well as Iran, Arab world and Turkey and its relationship to that, my education was at Goldsmiths College in London and the Royal College of Art, which is where I've trained as an art historian. And I was very much interested in this sort of punk legacy that was sort of a wave 10 years before me. So I was born in 79. So this is more rooted in the 1970s. And I was very much interested, like when I was born, it was obviously Thatcher era. It was a sort of very different sort of milieu, intellectually, culturally, in terms of multicultural ideas. But at Goldsmiths, which was sort of those of you that are familiar with this university, was the sort of foundational place for the YBAs. They were the young British artists. And they were about a generation prior to myself, but a lot of their methodology sort of looked at nonconformity, looked at punk sort of ideology and thinking. And it was sort of the shadow that I was sort of, the legacy rather, that I was part of. And my sort of generation became more interested in something that was a new contemporaries, but very much sort of rooted in that sort of punk thinking. And it was a moment of, critical reflection. A lot of the artists or the formation of punk methodology actually came from art schools. So London, Leeds, Manchester, sort of key cities around the United Kingdom were sort of producing this output of sort of non-conformist ideas and thinking. They were very much sort of rooted in going against a sort of very particular sort of historical moment of that time. And somehow I was very much influenced by all of that. And the idea of thinking about bricolage really is sort of a core tenet of punk, which was basically taking and remixing existing ideas, which is where the punk Orientalism comes from. I certainly didn't invent punk and I did not invent Orientalism, but joining them together creates a sort of new rubric for rethinking sort of rebellion, but also revolution. And 79 is sort of a key moment for me. Also, it was the year of the Iranian Revolution, and I'm half Iranian. It was not only the Iranian Revolution, but it was also the Soviet-Afghan War. And it was also a lesser-known incident known as the sort of event of Mecca, in which a group of insurgents stormed the holy house of Mecca. And it sort of changed the course of everybody who was from that region. People couldn't go back to Iran anymore. I mean, my parents were students in the 60s in London. They were sent to study abroad. But it also meant that our contours were shaped very differently. Everything sort of changed at that moment. There was a sort of shape-shifting era. And when I think about my own research, it's sort of sandwiched somewhere between 1979 and 9/11. And during that sort of period, there's sort of a very sort of changing or sort of shape-shifting sort of events. So you have 79, then you have 89, which is the sort of fall of the Berlin Wall. It's the end of apartheid. It's the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. It's the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And you have all these sort of different formations happening. And then you have, a few years later, the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union. And what sort of drew me to Central Asia, it's not only because of my ethnicity, because I am also half Central Asian and half Iranian, it was also an alternative paradigm. I was always interested in how 2/3 of the world did not look to Europe and North America to define themselves. They looked to the former Soviet Union. And I was always really sort of interested in ideas that were sort of looking at horizontal trajectories of art history, not the sort of vertical understanding of how we sort of define in Western art history. We have very different sort of chronological sort of moments. I was interested in ideas around cultural interruptions, so revolutions, ruptures, the sort of aftershocks of imperialism, colonialism, all of that sort of helped shape and inform my own curatorial practice. So when the sort of book came about, it was a synthesis of, let's say, 17 years of curatorial practice at the time. So it's very much rooted in my curatorial work. in a sense that the book brings together this sort of period between 2005 and 2022, 2021, curatorial projects, and sort of then formulates them, rethinks them within a literary sort of formation. And it was sort of really interesting for me to think about my own work and my own sort of art historical sort of journey, in the sense that my practice is artist-led. And what I mean by that is I'm interested in artist-led art historical narratives, particularly looking at parts of the world where there hasn't been this sort of smooth lineage, where there have been sort of interruptions, where artists have had to take on multiple roles, whether that be, you know, in academia, peer-driven support, DIY exhibitions, and so forth. They're sort of very much reliant on the artist's hand and the artist's mind, which has sort of been very important to my own thinking about how art history has sort of been formulated in these parts of the world. In particular, when I think about sort of the state-sponsored sort of academic sort of route, and then the parallel practice of what artists were sort of initiating, particularly those that were sort of existed behind the Iron Curtain, which is the area that I'm most interested in. But having said that, I'm also really interested in this idea of parallel practices where artists converge who have never met one another, whose ideas exist in parallel to one another despite having never met, or despite having not access to their work, or rather the back door of art history. So one such example is that in the former Soviet Union, artists from Central Asia and Caucasus learned about Western artists through anti-American, anti-European propaganda. So it was sort of going through a backward channel, if you like. But that enabled a sort of study, or a parallel study, that wasn't sort of the formulaic pathway. So that sort of formed a lot of the thinking here. And Orientalism sort of is really key. Those of you are probably familiar with the writing of Edward Said, who wrote the book Orientalism in 1978. So Edward Said, the late intellectual, he was also a professor at Columbia University, wrote about, you know, how the West imagined the East. And it's sort of a very seminal text. And he wrote several other texts as well, and he's of Palestinian origin. And Orientalism, in the way that he had presented it, explored the relationship about how the West imagined the East in its sort of imagination, how it sort of extracted certain ideas around knowledge and thinking, but also about occupation as well. So it was sort of threefold ideas that were sort of very important and seminal. But somehow I struggled with that, because his sort of understanding was this polarized East-West. And I was more interested in the middle space. I was interested in the second world. And by that, I meant I was interested in the relationship between East versus East. For me, USSR represented the East. I was more interested in this sort of dialogue. I actually started my PhD looking at Soviet Orientalism, and then sort of shifted to look at sort of wider decolonial practices in curatorial frameworks in Western institutions. I've worked in both Western and Eastern institutions. Now I'm based in Uzbekistan, but prior I had been a curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim in New York, as well as Tate Modern in London, and had been independent in a variety of different geographies in the Middle East and Central Asia also. So for me, it was about thinking about these ideas as a fragmented jigsaw puzzle, how they come together, but then how do I then sort of think about them within their own sort of frameworks as well. So in thinking about the book, it sort of came together in thinking about the relationships that don't really get a lot of traction. Thinking about how is it that East and East can also be in dialogue. Not to say that it sort of cuts off the West, that's not the intention, but it was a very particular art historical study and a very personal project. I like to think of this book as a form of reciprocal cultural labor between 31 artists. And the way it's designed, as you'll see when it makes the rounds, is that isn't following a chronological order. There are 7 chapters which can be dipped in and out, because what you notice in the beginning is that the artists take the lead. So they appear at different junctures throughout the book. And that's sort of really significant for me, that the introduction is all you really need to sort of read, and then you can read backwards, if you like. You know, you can start the book in any order that you feel. So in thinking about these sort of two diverse ideas, punk and Orientalism, I sort of wanted to sort of add a subtitle thinking about rebellion, because punk was all about rebellion. It was about sort of breaking ideas down, rebuilding. But I think also it was very important for me to look beyond the borders of Western Europe. For me, it was sort of a decisive decision, even when I was at Goldsmiths College, to look beyond the borders of the EU, to sort of think through what was happening east of the European Union. And that was sort of an area of fascination always. I mean, I could have had a very different career if I had gone the other way, but it was sort of thinking that sort of at Goldsmiths that really sort of helped solidify a lot of these ideas. And I think that that's something that sort of helped me along the journey of my curatorial practice. I'm very much interested in the scholarly approach to art making and how artists sort of also have this very pragmatic scholarly approach to their thinking, which sort of really served me well, because I don't think that I could have learnt from a theorist as much as I learnt from being in an artist studio. Sort of really helped support my thinking. So I'm indebted to these artists. And so I will sort of talk through now the book. Although I mentioned that there are no set chapters, I do start to give you a little bit of a chronology when it comes to the book in some terms of its formation. The first chapter in the book is entitled Great Games, and it was a sort of nod at the 19th century great game, 1850s, that for autobiographical reasons, my family was sort of involved in this historical moment. So the Great Game was a very important sort of moment in Central Asian history. It was sort of a jostling between Great Britain, Imperial Russia, with Central Asia at the center. And Afghanistan played a sort of critical moment in that thinking. And it was a sort of idea that I wanted to expand on what kind of games, geopolitical games there are, and how artists sort of interpret that. Games that are in the celestial, let's say, in the sky, those that exist on a terrestrial level, and those that happen in the subterranean. And behind me are some examples of some artworks and projects that I was involved in that was starting to sort of rethink this idea of recreation and what that meant. So here there is a work I'll point to by an Iranian-British artist called Reza Aramesh, entitled I Am a Believer. And those of you that are familiar with the Sex Pistols and their lyrics will know that that is a play on one of their famous songs. And this was a live action that was commissioned by ICA in London in 2006, which was a reenactment of the changing of the guard, which is sort of the protection of the British monarchy. It sort of symbolizes that. But he has solicited young men of migrant background, origin. And it was a nod to a lot of the classmates that Reza had, but also, he also studied at Goldsmiths College, incidentally. But it was also a way into thinking about Windrush sort of culture. Windrush was a very particular moment in British history where the sort of former people from the former colonies of the Caribbean came to the UK. And that was sort of really important for the formation of punk, particularly in the musical sort of sense, because music started to sort of mix with reggae and so forth. And this was sort of the start of a multicultural society, post-war British society that was truly multicultural at that time. So a lot of the people that were sort of featured within this particular project were from those backgrounds originally. And yet, so there was this idea of the protection of the monarchy, except there's an absence of any weaponry here as well. And then on the top is an artwork of a Rubik's Cube with the colors of the Afghan flag. And it's sort of like a bit of a puzzle in a sense that the problem of Afghanistan, starting from the Great Game, has never been able to be solved. No one has been able to ever solve the situation of Afghanistan. And it's sort of a lot of the work that I was doing when I was formulating the book was in retrospect to this period of 79, to the war that happened most recently as well, and the sort of chaotic sort of conclusion of that. And Afghanistan features in every chapter of the book. And at the bottom is a work by Lydia Abdul entitled In Transit. And it's sort of, again, thinking about younger populations, but it's a filmic work in which children are playing at a ruin of an abandoned Soviet army plane. They're filling all the bullet holes with cotton wool. And cotton is a commodity that comes up frequently in the book. I like to refer to it as white gold. Cotton has a very turbulent history. Cotton was obviously cultivated in the United States. when the advent of slavery ended, it went to India, and after India gained its independence from the British, it went to Uzbekistan. And there it was sort of cultivated under Stalin's plan. And we'll come to that a little bit later, because cotton had the sort of function of what oil, a little bit similar to fur as well, also had this sort of properties as well. And here we start to enter other geopolitical sort of games. And I wanted to sort of point to these horizontal sort of ideas that I was speaking about earlier. Diagonally, you see a work by Ali Sherry. And actually, incidentally, he's also one of the artists in the SITESANTAFE International Project of Cecilia also. And this is an earlier video work that's looking at the very colorful life of a Soviet-era cosmonaut called Mohammad Faris, except Mohammad Faris was from Syria, and he was given the highest civilian honor by the Soviet Union. He was given the medal, and he, as part of a state-sponsored mission that was sponsored by the former Soviet Union into space. Yet he was given this sort of honor. So you start to see these sort of relationships emerging. And the bottom is an image also from Ali Sherry's work. So it's the diagonal images of Bashar al-Assad's, the dictator's statue being brought down. So you sort of start to see these sort of parallel histories. Above is a work by Ekaterini Gagassian that's exploring the space race. And the space race is one of the most important sort of recreational activities during the USSR and the Cold War era. And it was something that was happening in the skies, particularly between the United States and the former Soviet Union. But ironically here, as a feminist artist of Greek and Armenian origin, she's looking at gymnastics, and particularly this era of sport. We see the rockets going up, but all the women are falling. So that's a collage series that she has created. And adjacent to that is a work by a Turkish-Bulgarian artist called Ergin Shavashulu. Those of you that play chess will see that this is incorrect. This work is entitled Double Attack. It's based on Duchamp's chess problem. And here, those of you that play chess know that the white figure always has a priority. Here, the dark figures, the black figure has been doubled. And it sort of changes the sort of notion of gaming here. And I mentioned to you that cotton, a sought-after commodity, had a very interesting parallel with fur. So the Russian fur trade went all the way to Siberia. And this is a project by Taus Makacheva, who also adorns the book, Standing on the Camel cover, and in which she looks at illegal car racing in Dagestan, in the North Caucasus. And Dagestan is one of the countries adjacent to Chechnya who have never received their independence from when the Soviet Union collapsed. They are still considered sovereign territory of Russia. And here she sort of goes undercover, a little bit reference to Venus in Furs, with a car that's entirely covered by these flea market find coats. And it's a 4x4, but it's sort of, and then these men are rather intrigued about it, are stroking it. But it did have a sort of interesting connotation and thinking. You know, there was an old saying that from the Tsar's shoulder, you know, it was fur had this sort of very regal connotation. It also did elsewhere as well, but in particularly in this part of the world. But again, it was a sort of reference to what fur, cotton, oil, these sort of commodities and their sort of function within imperial and colonial societies. And the second chapter in the book is entitled By Proxy. And I really wanted to sort of think through how societies and thinking was sort of characterized during the Cold War period. As I mentioned, 2/3 of the world didn't look to Europe and North America. They looked to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was very much infiltrating sort of society. And conversely, you had United States and Europe that were sort of very much involved with Iran. Sorry, I've just gone, forward. So I wanted to talk about this project by Ala Yunus, who is an artist of Kuwaiti origin, but also Palestinian origin. And she worked with Orhan Tukab, a Palestinian artist, to sort of unearth Soviet archives that were established, film clubs and language clubs that were established throughout the Arab world during the 50s and 60s, in which Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine were very much aligned with the thinking of the Soviet Union. And these film clubs sort of functioned as a form of sort of visual cultural propaganda, but also film was used as a tool to mobilize the masses. And in particular, in unearthing these canisters of film, these sort of, and this is the only centerfold in the book also, the only photographic essay, you start to sort of see this very interesting picture emerge that film was very much used as a tool for propaganda. And also literature as well. Many books were translated into Arabic language and sort of surfaced and sort of were migrating, but film was also used to mobilize people. And in my current work in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, there's also a very sort of interesting history between 68 and 88, in which the Tashkent Film Festival was sort of inaugurated, and which was also the dubbing of films into Russian language. It became a sort of interesting meeting point for people from the global majority as well. But film was sort of seen as a very interesting visual cultural medium that had that capacity to mobilize people and to sort of get them thinking about, ideas. And it was very much sort of rooted in this sort of capacity to mobilize people. If they could do that at mass scale, it was sort of really important. Other centers were also, Baku in Azerbaijan, adjacent to Tashkent in Uzbekistan, that were also sort of very much rooted in filmic history. Sort of parallel to that was the situation of Iran, because Iran was very much the eyes and ears of the United States in the 60s and 70s during the sort of reign of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. Reza Pahlavi was the monarch at that time. And it was sort of really interesting how art was sort of used as a proxy, in particular the CIA's role. So this was the time in which MoMA's collection was sort of being built, and how the CIA was very much involved in also mobilizing the masses. And these images are by an Iranian artist called Fahad Irania, and they are based on the oil refineries in Iran, which was sort of also the home to the Anglo-American oil sort of company that was sort of situated in Iran during the 20th century. And these were images of Martha Graham and her dancers that were sent by the CIA across different countries in West Asia, including Iran. And it's interesting, they went to all the major cities like Tehran, which is the capital, and elsewhere, but they also came to Abadan, which was a very working class part of Iran that would, that other than the engineers that worked there, the majority of the people were very poor. But then these dancers were sort of sent there to enchant them, which was very interesting. So you start to see two parallel sort of formations here that I wanted to explore in the book. And sort of moving on a little bit, I was also interested in the idea of landscaping, and particularly the use of the artist's hand as a tool to sort of rethink land and rethink the way in which land is tended to, the way in which land is reordered, and sort of, the sort of movement and thinking of how geography could be sort of moved around within the context of this fragmented jigsaw. And this is a project by Anton Ginsberg, which looks at the Aral Sea disaster. So the Aral is a word for a collection of lakes. And the Aral Sea was once a thriving lake situated between the borders of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And during the Soviet modernization project that sort of lasted between the 50s and the 60s, an entire area was sort of irrigated. Two main rivers were irrigated to feed the hungry desert where cotton was being cultivated. And it led to an absolute catastrophe, one of the sort of worst environmental catastrophes, in which these two lakes, which were once thriving sort of economies, fishing economies, and the population was there, eventually dried up. So having visited here, I've seen that it's like a sort of a, how can I put it, a graveyard for ships. And you see sort of the sort of remnants of this disaster. Also, this site was used for nuclear testing and dumping of nuclear waste. There are many, many sort of deformities and illnesses that were sort of as a consequence of this terrible atrocity. And only recently, Uzbekistan has been allowed to talk about this, and this point was taken to the United Nations 2 years ago and addressed there as well. And now the Aral Sea Summit is taking place in Uzbekistan, which is sort of looking at these histories, but also connecting them to other parts of the world. And as we're in Santa Fe. I'm also aware that there is a parallel history here of such activity also. And here, Anton Ginsberg, who is a Russian Jewish artist, I mean, it's important to raise his ethnicity because he wanted to take the sort of persona of wandering Jew, and he traverses the length of the Aral Sea, and with a camera, sort of a mirror, on his back, and sort of to reflect upon this period of history. And he sort of goes through, and for him, it's sort of very much rooted in his own history, his own ethnicity of being Jewish, being Russian, and also the weight of that history that occurred there. And other works that sort of explore land sort of reformation, thinking about vertical and horizontal trajectories, particularly longitudinal, latitudinal ideas, is again the work of Ergin Shavashvili. You start to see that the artists appear at different junctures. And here, this is an anamorphic drawing, which has been shown in different typographies. It's entitled Dust Breeding, and again, a reference to Duchamp, and particularly Duchamp's friendship with Man Ray, and sort of large glass, the photographic work with dust motes in which he affixed dust on Man Ray's photograph after it had accumulated dust over a year, and the idea of raising dust. And this anamorphic drawing is actually from a cement factory on the outskirts of Istanbul, Turkey, and it's sort of a reference to industrialization. And I had sort of mentioned earlier the idea of cultures of interruption. So Istanbul, a city in Ankara is the capital of Turkey. Istanbul is sort of major city in Turkey that is still going through industrialization. So in Europe, industrialization all sort of concluded during the Victorian era. But in countries that have had different sort of interruptions, Turkey maybe a bit less because it had the Ottoman Empire, but again, that was sort of disrupted, are still going through industrialization. Shanghai, Dubai, all these sort of different topographies are still going through that. There isn't that clear-cut understanding of what is postmodern, what was earlier modern, what was then postmodern, what is contemporary, sort of, and that's something important that we're grappling with still when we think about sort of energy, cleaner energy, factories that are still polluting, causing greenhouse gases and so forth, that without pointing any fingers, to think about how these ideas can then evolve, who is responsible to provide the solutions for these greener sort of ideas. And as we traverse over the floor of this work, you raise dust. Again, there's a sort of reference to dust being a sort of particle matter, but also the matter that we then return to that. So it's been shown in a few different topographies. So in Dubai, in the Solomon Guggenheim as part of a project that I did, and also in Milan as well. So it's had sort of different readings where it travels to. And again, sort of Afghanistan sort of concludes this chapter, and this is another work by Lida Abdul entitled What We Have Overlooked. It's an earlier work from 2011, but it was sort of really interesting to think about this within the context of a sort of chaotic pullout of the troops under Biden's administration, and that's sort of what that left, that vacuum that left behind in Afghanistan, and sort of then this sort of unfortunate revival of the Taliban, who are now being recognized in majority of the world as the official party of Afghanistan. And then I move on to another chapter that I was sort of really interested in. And again, the sort of hand of the artist becomes sort of really a critical tool. And it's entitled Whistleblowing. And those of you that are familiar with sort of whistleblowing understand that what its connotations are and what that means for artists to sort of take risk. And it's, it's not risk adverse, let's put it that way. It's very much a risk as an active sort of alert. And I was very much interested in the work of Mitra Tabrizian, who's an artist that I've been working with for a number of years, an Iranian-British artist who came to study in the United Kingdom. And then when the revolution happened, she couldn't go back. And this sort of, I've done a sort of interesting pairing here of two works by her. The first one is entitled Surveillance. And it's a work that was produced prior to digital era. It was an analog era image which she literally had to stitch together by hand. And it's, it sort of looks at Guy Debord's idea of the society of spectacle. It sort of starts to sort of think about Iran's history. And in particular, sort of its bookends, the sort of interference of the British intelligence, the CIA, and then you have sort of demise of women, because after the revolution, women were demoted from their position, from being judges and having seniority in Iranian civic life. Unfortunately, Iran in 79 went back to, it was an Islamic revolution that then favored a Sharia Islamic law that led to this sort of travesty. But it wasn't something that happened sort of overnight. And it was very much rooted in the CIA's sort of overthrowing of our democratic prime minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was overthrown because he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil, which then led to a coup in which then the Shah was brought back for absolute monarchy in Iran. So it was a sort of very difficult moment, and one doesn't need to go back too far in Iranian history. One can look to the modern period to sort of understand where we are now. And this image sort of encapsulates many different sort of critical sort of junctures in 20th century Iranian history. One of the sort of promises of the Iranian Revolution, and I have to say that the revolution of Iran was not intended to be an Islamic revolution. It was supposed to be a socialist intellectual revolution. I mean, my grandparents themselves were intellectual Iranian Marxists, and they wanted the revolution, and that was sort of brought together by intellectuals such as lawyers, economists. Sadly, when the revolution happened, majority of these people were murdered, or those that were not already in exile. And so they were the first wave to be killed, and then it became a sort of a theocratic state. And one of the promises was to bring equality. You know, one of the promises of the Iranian Revolution was to bring equilibrium to Iranian society, because there was a huge disparity of wealth, and that was one of the key criticisms of the Iranian monarchy at the time. It's sort of extravagant spending and so forth. And this is contrasted by this piece by Mitra, in which she looks at a part of south of Tehran, which is where it's very working class there. You sort of see the image of Khomeini and Khamenei sort of looming over the public, but you also see this sort of desolate landscape, because the promise was to build housing, to give jobs, but nothing really has changed. So she sort of didn't stage this photograph. These were people that lived in these homes in this tower block that was sort of neither here nor there, waiting for something, in a sense, this sort of limbo. So the promise was never fulfilled of this revolution, when it became a sort of very theocratic sort of activity, which unfortunately, to the detriment of the Iranian people, is still, we have a very young population in Iran. It's 70% of the country is under the age of 30, and that's obviously to do with the war. But, you know, highly educated society, you know, most people go on to postgraduate studies, highly sophisticated, yet are living under this sort of confines. The sanctions don't make it any easier as well. That is putting tremendous pressure on the young people there. And sort of in the activity that we've sort of seen when the book was released in 2022, it was a month after the killing of Mahsa Amini, the young lady who was not properly robed, covered, and she sadly was beaten by the morality police, which then led to her sad demise and, you know, very unfortunate passing away. But then something has changed in the society, where you see these young people are brewing, and now you see girls who choose not to cover, and they take that risk. So the idea of risk is very much present. And another project I want to highlight sort of starts to look at how ideas were sort of brewing in Iran, but then which was a sort of precursor to what then became the Arab Spring in the Arab world. So Iranians are Persians, and then we have the Arab Spring in the Arab world. And there was a lesser known, sort of less publicized event in 2009 in which scores of youth were sort of very angry with the rigged election in Iran in 2009, which led to the internet being cut off in Iran. So no press was allowed, there was no freedom of press, and scores were murdered, beaten, and left in a terrible state. And this is a project by Rokni Herazadeh, and it's really interesting. It gave one of my exhibitions at the Solomon R. Guggenheim its title, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise. And those of you that know your continental art theory and theory in general know that that's from Walter Benjamin. and his last essay, thesis on philosophy, last project before his own death and sad demise. And it's a project in which the artist takes newsreel from YouTube, CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, prints them and paints atop of them. Instead of using human sort of heads, he covers each with an animal head. It sort of becomes a sort of allegorical sort of commentary, if you like, about society. And it sort of heralds back to a very important Iranian play called Tales of the City that was sort of very popular, in which animals were used to allegorize and tell moral tales. So it didn't use people, it used animals instead. And it sort of goes back to a very ancient Indian sort of text as well, in which animals were sort of used to talk about morality and how to live in a moral way. And here he's done that, but also you see these very dystopian use of fluorescent light. And it was really interesting because when I first moved to the United States in 2015, it was sort of the precursor to Trump's election. So alternative facts, the sort of use of social media to create viral news was sort of really coming to being. You know, the use of disinformation and misinformation was being something that was being talked about, you know, at a very sort of high level. There was a task force and everything sort of emerging as well to sort of combat these ideas. And then it was interesting for me to think about this. It was also Julian Assange's trial. There was so much happening in this period of history when I was sort of ideating this exhibition and then looking at this work, which then also became part of the Guggenheim's collection as well. And then another chapter in the book is entitled Poetic Code. And it's something that I'm very much interested in. Code is a sort of a language that, you know, it can be gibberish, it can be Morse code, it can be, you know, something that's hieroglyphics, it can be symbols. It doesn't have to have sort of a textual sort of understanding. And how does poetry sort of co-opt and sort of become a sort of ally to code? And, you know, being Persian, we have such a strong history of poetry. And poets were the one people in society, in Iranian society, who could get away with anything. Because the language was always so ambiguous, in a sense that, you know, obviously Rumi, Hafiz, Saidi, we have a great legacy of poetry that sort of lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was a very important sort of critical device, you know, that one could embed many things, you know, and hide them. And I was interested in contraband that existed within poetry, but not something illegal, but thinking about smuggling as a sort of tool and how smuggling can be used as a code. It can be part of a poetic code as well. This image is of an oil tanker, Far's Iranian oil, gas, if you like. And it's again by Farhad Irania. And it was something I was interested in, so coming back to these ideas of commodity, but also thinking about globalization as well. I mean, globalization happened on the Silk Road hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It didn't happen in the 90s in Western Europe. So it's something really interesting to think about and how to decipher that as well. And these works are based on the idea of the Silk Road, what was smuggled in. The Silk Road wasn't just, you know, the trading of spices that happened in Asia that then came to Europe through Venice. It was also people. And, you know, people were also smuggled, ideas were also smuggled. And that was something I was very interested in sort of bringing forth here as well. And one of the important projects that I did a few years ago was entitled Migrosophia. It was a sort of amalgamation between two words, migration and philosophy. And it was based on a project by Zigam Azizov, who's an Azerbaijani artist, and the late Stuart Hall, who was a Jamaican media theorist and an intellectual in Great Britain. He was based there. And this was based on a poster project that they did for Venice called Migrosophic Transformation. And that was curated by Hans-Ulrich Obrist for the 50th Venice Biennale in 2003. What was a poster project then became a sort of rough guide for globalization. And particularly then became a sort of interest for me to work with Zigam to create an exhibition entitled Migrosophia. And it was a way in which to look at artists from Central Asia, Caucasus, and Iran, and their sort of confluence and connections. And in particular, sorry, go back a little bit, is a work by Zigam, which was his actual passport. So Passport 2000 is actually based on a quotidian object, you know, sort of ultimate ready-made, what a passport allows. It allows us to move, or it also allows you to be denied, depending on what passport you have. So when the Soviet Union, when the Berlin Wall fell, he tried to enter with his Azerbaijani passport into Berlin. He was given a denied stamp at that point, you know. So after years and years of, you know, being able to sort of move freely, the world had sort of shifted and rethought in that way. Germany had sort of unified. So when this activity happened to him, he then decided to create an artwork out of this. And in the Austrian Der Standard newspaper, his passport was published as an artwork, which was then circulated throughout Austria. And although the newspaper is based in Vienna, so it was an interesting project that became sort of idea of the ready-made. And sort of, again, a Duchampian sort of idea here being used, but then how does that then circulate? And thinking about the migration of people, also the migration of ideas. Again, another work by Ergin Shavashvili entitled Liminal Crossing also looks at the period of when, after the Soviet Union collapsed, in which all Turkish people from Bulgaria were forcibly, either they had to convert to Christianity, or they were asked to leave and go to Turkey. And his family were part of the Ottoman Empire's legacy. And Ottoman Empire was 400 years. It wasn't just in Turkey, it was also the whole of the Arab world, it was the former Yugoslavia, and it even went up to the Horn of Africa as well. And so it was several hundred years of people living here. And it was very interesting that this work was based on his autobiography, family sort of event, in which when his family had to leave Bulgaria, they were able to push his sister's piano between two borders without any stoppage or impediment or anything by the authorities. And ordinarily, you are stopped for much less. Somehow they let them go. Maybe it became a very poetic gesture that this family were then pushing his sister's piano. And so he created this work, and we decided to install it so it looks like it bleeds into the ground, as well as very beautiful work. And moving on, we're coming to the end, and I might do a little reading if we have time, is a chapter entitled Alphabet Politics in the book. And this is sort of very much rooted in the use of the letter and the word. And a work that's sort of been and an artist who's been very sort of significant to me is Vasylav Akunov, who is an Uzbek artist who spent the majority of his professional life under house arrest for his activism. So even as early as the 70s, he refused to fight in the Afghan war, which most of the Soviet Union had to be part of. And he was slipped a note for his sort of political activism, which was this. And those of you that can read Cyrillic, anybody here? This says, breathe quietly. In other words, shut up. And he was sort of given this sort of warning, which then became a drawing. And he's an artist that I've been working with for a number of years, since 2005. And this drawing is sort of very significant. Here, Here it morphs into letters. So breathe quietly becomes an action to sit quietly. And it sort of takes on an architectural sort of function here as well. And he's very much interested in mantras. So sit quietly, breathe quietly. It's very much rooted for him in sort of Sufi ideology, which is relevant to Central Asia, given its sort of affiliation with the Islamic world. And it sort of became a sort of precursor. It was very interesting that he didn't have the opportunity to actually create this work until many, many decades later. So when you look at his practice, a lot of works exist within drawings because they were ideas for 3D objects that were sort of never realized. And it's a very interesting practice because he didn't stop. And he's one of the examples of somebody that I mentioned who had a parallel practice. He wasn't part of the Moscow conceptualist school. He wasn't aware of what Lawrence Weiner was doing here in the United States. He wasn't aware even of some of his paintings and his color sort of investigations of what others were doing. He's done work with light, and he had no idea what Robert Morrison was doing. Yet there's this sort of parallel sort of practice, and that's something that I urge everybody to think about, in terms of their work, how we can sort of connect to different nodes or different constellations, same periods, but completely different geographies, yet you see a semblance, you see a sort of overlap between the artist practices. And I've spoken a little bit about this, so we'll sort of come back to this artist being sort of very, very significant to me. Zigam Azizov is a microscopia artist, but also his use of language and the use of text. And, when I was growing up in London, we had something called teletext. And that was sort of this very beautiful news snippets, if you like. So you had sort of sporting results, the weather, and then you would have this sort of text going around the television in a different color. But it was sort of very interesting because it was sort of headlines, news bites. And then this artist is sort of very much interested also in the idea of headlines, and particularly the sort of what is embedded within the English language. And by that, what I mean is sort of, I want you to think of it a bit like a sandwich. So sort of the two sentences that are spoken, and then what resides in the middle, like the filling of the sandwich, is really what is being said. It's not the two sentences, it's the hidden one. And which is sort of very interesting. Those of you who are interested in language would be able to sort of confer with that. So he took a series of headlines from the BBC. And BBC is the British Broadcasting Corporation, so it already has an inherently colonial sort of function. And these are some of the headlines that he had chosen. Germany, to use voice recognition, and then others were sort of using sort of metaphorical and sort of allegorical language to compare children from Calais who are in a refugee camp to a jungle and so forth. So very decisive uses of language, but then very much sort of within the bookends of a headline, but what is being said is what one must decipher between the two sentences. And this was part of his Venice Biennale project for the 58th Venice Biennale in 2019. And then he also was very interested in the use of Twitter, sort of headlines then sort of becoming sort of precursor to Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, Facebook, and sort of the Orwellian sort of ideas as well, the sort of inherent, this is a news scenario as a social love story. And he talks about this woman. He said, I met her on Facebook. We have never met in life, but nevertheless, we became friends. Now she keeps sending me text messages and a stream of images from Instagram, Telegram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. She doesn't like an electronic mail and says it's too old-fashioned. She also likes news headlines. And he goes on to say she's very fond of Orson Welles as well, which is sort of really interesting in this context. And on the topic of language and literature, through my research and through my work, I was very much sort of interested in the convergence between USSR and the United States, and particularly looking at the sort of let's just say a red and a blue and a black history, and how these sort of colors and what they symbolize sort of come together. And through my research, I was sort of very fascinated to discover that Langston Hughes, who is poet laureate from the Harlem Renaissance, actually ended up going to Central Asia, going to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And he even published a memoir which is in Yale's Beinecke Library, about his time in Soviet Central Asia. But this was sort of by accident. So Langston Hughes he was part of a group of high-profile African-American figures that were invited to Moscow in the early formation, the 1920s, to make a film about how bad life was during Jim Crow segregated era. It was a propaganda film. And at that time, it was the early days of the Soviet Union, and America and its allies had not recognized USSR at this point. So he was invited to be part of this film project. All of a sudden, United States recognized USSR, and the film project got dropped. It's never been sort of explicitly said, but I think that's why they dropped it. And because their function was to create propaganda. And when they got what they wanted, they said, okay, we've cancelled the film. So instead of returning to the United States, Langston Hughes and his colleague decided to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and they ended up going to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. There he spent 3 years looking at the poetry of Uzbek poets and translating them into English. But it was very interesting for me that none of this history has ever been part of the official biography of Langston Hughes, yet you see a very important sort of convergence of literary history being sort of enacted in Central Asia, but also part of his autobiography and legacy here, to the point when I was going through these images with a colleague of mine, she said to me that I didn't realize that was Langston Hughes. I thought it was a local person. And I said, no, it's Langston Hughes with a turban. It's not a local person. And then the fact that he was also picking cotton in the field at leisure, not at a, in a sort of tragic circumstance. So it was very interesting that this was a sort of start of a literary sort of journey, which then became more formal in 1958. So in 1958, Uzbekistan in Tashkent initiated the Afro-Asian Literary Festival, which lasted until 1988. And during this literary festival, W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, and others came to Uzbekistan, as well as their counterparts from Asia. So it started becoming a sort of really interesting topography for the meeting point of people from the global south, and particularly people from the global majority. And then it sort of led to a film festival also. Parallel to that, I have the work by contemporary collective Slavs and Tatars, and their project, they're a collective that sort of looks at the Great Wall of China all the way to the Berlin Wall. Sort of that's their area of inquiry, if you like. And here they skewer these books that look at African American history, Soviet history, and American history. So you start to see these sort of formations, and let's just call them unusual pairings, but yet there already is a parallel practice that is worth exploring here. And then we come to almost the end of the book, and the chapter is entitled Unbuilt and Unbuildable, and it sort of starts to look at the ideologies of architecture. And it sort of also traverses to different geographies, and it starts to sort of look at more Orientalism proper. So this is a work by Inci Eviner, who is a Turkish filmmaker, and she's also sort of very much rooted her practices in drawing as well. And this is a video, actually, of an original drawing by Melling, who was an official court architect, illustrator for the Ottoman court. And he had created this original drawing, which showed inside of a harem. And he had produced these sort of figures, very mechanical, sort of a harem. Historically is a house, it's a space for females of a certain household. It's usually monarchy, sort of key figures who had kept a harem, and it wasn't a sort of place for all kinds of illicit activity, how it was sort of imagined. It was a space for learning. It was also a space for LGBTQ plus people who could sort of shapeshift between men and women and teach, particularly transgender people who took a very important time and position during the Ottoman court and other sort of dynasties as well in the Islamic world, where they would recite and learn poetry and come back and teach women. So they had a very interesting sort of role as shapeshifting between different sectors of society. So in her version, she brings all these sort of elements to light. In Melling's drawing is very sort of flat, if you like, very flat, very mechanical. But here there's a lot of sort of activity, non-conformist activity going on, with sort of a lot of humor as well in this particular work. So maybe you can see it on YouTube. I'm not sure for whether for copyright reasons she has actually put it, but it's very interesting. And in my last exhibition, I was able to pair the original drawing and this work together as well. And other sort of inquiries into sort of ideologies of architecture looks at monumentality and the history of monuments, in particular in Central Asia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all the statues of Lenin and Stalin, Marx, were all ripped down in a violent sort of fashion. And they were sort of replaced with heroes from Central Asia's past, like scientists and thinkers. It was a sort of unprogressive nostalgia, going back hundreds of years instead of looking forward. And the artist Bosin Meldebikov, his family album, which is at the top, sort of pairs images from his family, where they were sort of visiting various monuments. And before there was like Lenin's sort of shadow. And Lenin is a sort of key figure that appears in a lot of the artist's works. And then you see the sort of more current sort of pairing is with Genghis Khan or other sort of notable Khans from that region, Mongol sort of empire, and so on. And then he sort of also explores this idea of musical chairs, that every time there is a new leader, there is a new monument. And it was sort of really interesting to think about the history of monumentality when I was sort of curating these works and also bringing them together for the book in the end, is within the American context where I live, I was living. And so in thinking about the history of monumentality here, because there is such a desire, also a parallel sort of practice going on of ripping down these monuments and sort of erasing history. But then that is a question, I'm not one to argue. That is more for the people of America to decide. But it becomes an interesting sort of, how can we create these sort of transformers or amalgamation of monuments and what it means? Because for me, this was a form of unprogressive nostalgia to bring back heroes from hundreds of years. It sort of impeded growth because also it affected language, it affected social life as well, to sort of think back from a nostalgic perspective. But then how can one be both nostalgic and progressive? And how does that then manifest in public monuments, where there was also a very violent movement of ripping monuments down to certain figures, historical figures, rightly so in many ways because of what they represented, and replacing them with key figures from indigenous sort of communities, from African American communities and others. And I'm also really interested in this sort of this parallel between, can we be both nostalgic? Can we be both memorializing ideas? Can we be progressive? Or do we slip into some unprogressive sort of arena? But it's just sort of an open-ended sort of question. So just to sort of conclude, the work of Bosin Meldebikov at the bottom is entitled Seasons here, in which he looked at a square in Tashkent called Amor Timur Square, which is named after Timur the Great, or, Timur Lame, as we call him here. And it was sort of looking at 100-year history in which 10 monuments were erected to mark different sort of key figures. And it sort of became a bit absurd. It's sort of, the absurdity is also explored in his work called Pedestal, which is looking at a central square in Kyrgyzstan, in the capital city Bishkek, which has also a very revolutionary spirit. Kyrgyzstan isn't one of the rich stands, but it does have a spirit or richness in its people that have been able to significantly remove certain sort of rulers and then replace them with somebody else. But then he creates this sort of monument to sort of memorialize all of them at once. So it is a degree of absurdity. It is a sort of commentary on architecture and the ideological function of memorials or monuments, if you like. And then sort of to conclude completely today, I want to sort of return to Afghanistan again in this work entitled White House, again by Lida Abdul. And this was sort of represented in the Venice Biennial of that year. I believe it was 51st Venice Biennial that year. And she returned to Afghanistan after the Taliban were toppled. She was, her father used to write law for the government. He was a prominent lawyer, German educated, her mother also. But when the Soviet-Afghan war happened, they had to send the children out. And she was a sort of child refugee for many, many years. And then she was able to come back to Afghanistan after the Taliban were at that point toppled. And she said there were two things in abundance, ruins and graves. And in this particular work entitled White House, she's sort of painting the ruins white and sort of extends her reach to this man who's dressed in traditional Afghan attire, the costume, and she paints him white as well. Sort of it's a commentary on whitewashing. It's the idea of the White House where all these sort of geopolitical sort of decisions are made that impact various parts of the world. But it's also about rebirth. It's not all sort of one way sort of thinking. It's also sort of alluding to rebirth, rethinking what can sort of, what kind of new formations and ideas can one sort of ignite, and particularly the hand of the artist being sort of rethinking that, the sort of reevaluation of painting. There is so much sort of embedded within this work, and it's sort of the vernacular of painting as well, sort of very important here within this project. And I sort of conclude on that this evening. I'm actually going to read the conclusion of the book. So I'll start with a quote by Albert Camus from Resistance, Rebellion and Death. To create today is to create dangerously. Following the artist's lead, Punk Orientalism, the Art of Rebellion, presents art and ideas for my curatorial projects and writings and offers an alternative to the punk movement's proclamation of no future, because its interests lie in a different kind of future. The artists and artworks presented here are part of an international punk legacy of destabilizing fixed narratives, dispelling histories and regimes of polarization. They offer a new multifaceted prism for a different kind of future. Their practices allow for a process of remapping that navigates towards a broader discussion where several urgent issues inform one another. These areas include geopolitical games, proxies, conceptual landscaping, and poetic codes as alternative cultural barometers, alphabet politics, including the displacement of language and culture, whistleblowing, and the ideologies of formal and informal architecture in the making and unmaking of state narratives. In this book, the process of mixing and taking leaps between various chronologies and concepts is deliberate and is a tacit interpretation of punk methodology. In particular, the montage technique that stitches together non-linear ideas, words, and images from my curatorial practice is akin to the way in which visual cultural knowledge is currently consumed in the digital age. Through the abandonment of didactic approaches to art, histories, and rehistories, centers and peripheries related to the local, global, and virtual are mixed and explored using multiple directions and entry points. This has paved the way for a more nuanced debate on inner and outer forms of imperialism and their boomeranging effects. Throughout the book, I have attempted to highlight how punk Orientalism is a fluid and fragmented phenomenon, a rubric for accessing artistic practices that unveil historical and contemporary legacies of rebellion and social change in both post-colonial and post-Soviet societies. While perhaps outwardly disparate, these ideas are in fact mutually interdependent, and their union reveals interconnected realities about how future global trajectories might actually play out. More explicitly, it is not my intention for punk Orientalism to be read on the basis of a text that preaches any form of moral high ground. Instead, I hope that the art and ideas it presents might reframe how artists have utilized punk's transgressive gestures to subvert and shift between histories, analyze crisis, and actively disturb receive ideas via rebellious thought. After all, punk's logic is intimately invested in what came after punk. Why else would it declare no future if it were not preeminently concerned with the effects of its aftershocks?
I have a million questions and I want to try and condense it into one, which is really about your particular, and dare I say quite brilliant, curatorial methodology. You're talking about this horizontal exchange and really significantly thinking outside of Western Europe and North America. And there's a question I have for you that is a question that I've always wanted to ask of Mignolo's work on the similar topic, is what do you feel is the greatest challenge bringing these non-North American, non-Western European horizontal exchanges to a Western European and to a North American audience who are going, what is this? I don't understand it. I'd love to learn more about that.
That's a wonderful question, and it's a very important question that you raise, because anybody who has a challenge of bringing new ideas and new, especially those from different topographies and geographies, into sort of a question is something that I'm really thinking about, is this parallel practices that I mentioned today, because these artists aren't so dissimilar from what was happening in Europe and North America. Their concerns were very much sort of, one, what was sort of different is where they were located and what their access points were. It didn't mean they weren't creating. It didn't mean that they weren't part of these sort of parallel formations. They were just working on a different temperament, a different timeline, if you like. But those timelines collide. And, even using terms like global south, global north, they've become, we use them out of necessity because those are the sort of terms that are available to us, right? And, Walter writes about this a lot, in his sort of dark side of sort of colonial history and so forth. But I think is sort of really important is a thematic driven narrative. When you start to sort of think about artistic practices, you don't think, oh, where is this artist? Of course, their geography or their sort of cultural environment is going to play a very sort of important role on that. But these parallel sort of indices these conversations need to happen. And we saw that in Adriano Pedrosa's Venice Biennale, the last edition, in which he made an active sort of link to sort of remix and rechange, because he focused on Italians moving to Latin America. He also focused on, on Arab modernities sort of converging with European modernities as well. So, that included sort of Egyptian surrealists to all the way to modern artists who were part of like European educated, but then went on to like form Baghdad Art School and other sort of schools of thought. But you could see the interconnected sort of trajectories. And maybe, like if I go back to surrealism only because for me, that was a really important intellectual sort of movement. And maybe we haven't reached that again, we haven't come to that because it was truly global. You had surrealism went all over the world. You had its sort of roots, although we think of it as roots within French sort of intellectual sort of history, it was truly global because of what it sort of held, what it believed. And I would like to sort of think of that as a sort of key example that sort of went beyond some of these challenges. And I think, again, the 20th century plays a sort of important role in that. And whether we are yet to have another kind of renaissance in a sort of truly global movement, yet to be known. But I think this sort of, why I came back to the no future, because that was the sort of symbol of the punks. They always said, oh, no future, burn it down. But they weren't talking about destruction. It was about rebirth and rethinking. So I think these challenges, we can draw from art historical sort of moments to show that how these challenges were sort of remedied or how they were sort of operating. But it's sort of up to us as curators to sort of draw those sort of constellations, bring them into being, and to think about. But of course, those challenges remain. Something someone once said to me, actually, in a talk at the New York Public Library was, Sara, this is really fascinating, but we've never heard of these artists. You make it sound so interesting. And I didn't know what to say, and I just said, thank you. I said, thank you. But then I thought about it afterwards, what a strange question. And I said, well, I hope afterwards, I spoke to them after the question period, and I said, well, I hope it's an invitation then, because books also travel. They go to people's homes, they go into libraries, people touch them, they leave the DNA on them. And I think this sort of invitation, this is never intended to be top of the pops, like who are the best artists. It's a very personal book. It's about the reciprocal cultural exchange that I had with these 31 artists. It's different for everybody. But those challenges is what keeps us going. It doesn't, like many projects I did in Canada, for example, they were also grappling with many of the issues that I was looking at, particularly artists from the Middle East or Central Asia. There was also sort of, you start to see parallel sort of ideologies and thinking sort of happening. And even here in Santa Fe, I already drew so much thinking about what was happening in Central Asia. the sort of nuclear, the ecological sort of issues, what was residing behind the landscape, what was sort of happening. How do artists sort of grapple with that? It's not so dissimilar once you start to sort of see. Of course, it happens with its own historical cultural context, but the artistic practices sort of need to be sort of situated in parallel. And I think that would be a fantastic exhibition, or symposium rather, where we could bring together different artists to sort of talk about this parallel, because it doesn't pit them against each other. It starts to show how this sort of jigsaw puzzle of global art history is sort of formulated. And I think that's really important. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.